All right. I'm Joe Turner, and this is the City Manager Unfiltered podcast, a podcast for city managers and public sector executives. It is the most influential local government podcast in America, and we are on part 2 of my interview with Mike Grabianowski. He is with Grabianowski and Associates. We are talking about how contractors, how vendors can take you to the cleaners. They can rob you blind if you're not careful. And Mike is your own personal attack dog. Mike, welcome to the program. Why don't you quickly introduce yourself again for those who maybe didn't catch the first episode and share your bona fides.
Thanks, Joe. Great to be back. Yeah, so for those of you that are joining here for the first time, so I'm Mike Grabianowski, and I've started my own firm as of last year, at the end of last year. So I've got over 20 years experience. I spent the first half of my career, first 10 years or so, in operations and engineering, working in manufacturing facilities. And then I spent about 10 years or so, a little shy of 10 years, working for Georgia Pacific, part of Koch Industries, or having overall responsibility of a space known as commercial control. So that would be anything in the contracts realm where we're engaging with either vendors, suppliers for certain services that are being provided. And I would have oversight to make sure that they were billing us up to the terms and conditions of the contracts and making sure that we were not being overcharged. And that's among other things, but that was the main context of what I did.
So there you go, folks. You have Mike working for one of the largest privately held companies in the world, Koch Industries, the subsidiary, Georgia Pacific. Very intense, high pressure environment where, hey, you're expected to perform. That's not a make work job for good old Mike Grabianowski with Koch Industries. So, Mike, you're working on projects up to 9 figures, over $100 million. Obviously, that's a huge, massive amount of money. What has been your experience during this whole process as far as overbilling? Like, what is on average? What is typical in the private sector, at least from your experience? What have you been seeing over those years?
Contractors typically, and different sources will tell you different numbers, but a lot of firms that do work similar to mine, if they do recovery audits, they kind of anchor somewhere between 2 and 3%. I can tell you that range a little wider. Last year, in 2024 within GP, our number was averaging, and it varied year to year, was a little over 4%. So we had a very successful year recovering money in 2024. So it's in that band of, I'd say, 2 to 5, and it depends on a lot of different factors. I could tell you, and I'm not going to dime out certain industries, but there are a handful of industries in my mind right now that I actually had someone tell me when I first started doing this work. They said, "Do you audit contractors in this specific area?" And I said, "Not that often." I said, "That's not one I really." I said, "You have to. They're all thieves." And he's right. I couldn't find one that actually did not overcharge. And like I
Now,
said,
does this industry serve local government on a frequent basis, or no?
oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Not nearly as much as they would a private entity like GP, but they do provide services to municipalities. I can guarantee you that. Usually, I would say probably wastewater facilities would probably be the number one client of theirs.
yeah, okay. So Mike, when you're looking at, you say, hey, we got 2 to 5%, overbilling. You know, is that a lot of money when you're looking at a project that's under $1 million? Is there a point to bring somebody like you on board for that organization? And I guess the other thing too is, 2 to 5% obviously takes its toll on a larger dollar amount value project. Obviously, I get all that, but is there also something to be said for vendors knowing that there's a watchdog on scene watching the sort of the process, as opposed to just feeling like they're left unattended to do whatever they want to do?
Oh yeah. So yeah, a few things to unpack this. The first one, like where does it really matter? Like the 2 to 4%. So when you're talking like $100,000 project, what do you got? A couple grand, three, four,
Right.
5 grand. Doesn't really get anyone's attention. But once you get over $100,000 or $100 million, now you're talking several $1 million
Right.
potentially in overbillings. Now you're talking a beach house. Now you get someone's attention. And the other thing is aggregate spend. So it's not necessarily just on a PO amount. I would always look at aggregate spend, and it's something very important. So, for instance, in the private industry, a good test of controls is to look for splitting POs. So let's say hypothetical, no industry ever wants to, or no company ever wants to give what's their competitive bidding threshold. You never want that number to be known by anybody. So let's pretend for a minute that it's $10,000. So let's say you have $10,000 set up for your competitive bidding threshold. You're going to see any company can do this test. I guarantee you're going to see all these POs that are cut at $9,900, $9,900, $9,900. I once had a controller tell me that they were sick and tired of all these bids coming in just below where the competitive guidance was. So you know what that person did? They said, I cut it in half. And I figured, you know what? And then all of a sudden we have all these POs that are $100 less than that, $100 less than that, $100 less than that. So you just keep this like the Russian nesting dolls. That's something where you need. I always look at cumulative spend. So it's not necessarily on a PO basis or a project basis. Somebody like, for instance, some factories or mills, they like to use a certain contractor. It's their favorite. You'll see that they choose not to competitively bid it, and they'll use something what's known as an RFA. So in private industry, you can actually not bid if you can show that through some justification or rationalization that's in your best interest not to bid it. And some people will try to exploit that. And that was one of my jobs, was to look at that and look at the reasonableness of what was used for the justification for not bidding something out. But you have to look at, is someone being used prolifically at a really high rate across the organization? That's where you want to think about it, because it's going to below the radar. You may not see it. That's why a lot
Yeah.
of the tools that I created when I was there looked for cumulative spend, because that's where I was concerned. I was concerned with things that cumulative in nature. That's where that 2 to 4% really adds up,
Right.
and not just on a project by project basis.
I could see there being a benefit, honestly, just for a city manager or public works director to hire somebody like you, even on a project that isn't necessarily an ideal fit, just because you want to send a message to the marketplace like, oh, we are watching our stuff, like we are being more aggressive about monitoring how we're being billed and what have you. But be that as it may, what would you say ideally when you have we talked about some of the ideal conditions for you to come in and provide value to an organization based off of turnover of staff or inexperienced staff, but when you actually go to, say, project type and size, Mike, where does it start hitting a sweet spot for the gains to really kind of to pay dividends for that relationship with you? Can you give an idea of like what the project dollar amount would be, what the type of project would be? I'm assuming what you just said a minute ago on the wastewater plant. So any type of like building of a facility is going to have a lot of moving pieces, and that's where you're going to add a lot of value. Is that fair to say?
Oh yeah, yeah. I never. And this is it's maybe my own personal fault at GP. I would never turn away a customer, because, as I stated on our last call, $200,000 to maybe a lumber mill is a huge deal versus $200,000 to a very large mill that makes toilet paper. Yeah, they might light their cigarettes with that.
Right.
So it's a small amount of money. So they're going to be less concerned with. So it looks so, and I think the same thing would exist here within municipalities. A very small town that maybe has a Dollar General and a Wendy's. A small project to them might make or break their year, or may make them look very bad in front of all their constituents that are taxpayers. So I think it's a case by case basis. Now, would the city of Chicago call me up for a $200,000 project? Yeah, if they're going to probably call me up, I'll be there tomorrow if they need me. Um, it would be something probably in the neighborhood of tens of millions of dollars at least, in order
Right.
for it to be worth their time and in mine as well. However, I wouldn't necessarily turn someone away. If somebody comes to me, and I love to give free advice. I think people could
You're
tell.
not a gatekeeper.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you if you want advice, I can give it to you. So I wouldn't want to necessarily scare someone away from actually saying, hey, but you know what, he wouldn't take me as a client. What I would say is it's all case by case basis. A small project, I might be able to do something for you from afar. Like, for instance, if somebody called me up from Oregon and said, "Hey, I've got a $250,000 project," I would say, "Well, it's not worth me coming out there to help you with your project. Let me see what I can do from afar. Let's see if I can review your invoices from afar." Well, you could do some things remote. You could do some things in person. So depending on the nature and the context of the scope that I engage with my client is going to dictate how that goes. And so I wouldn't want to necessarily push someone away, and I wouldn't want to say, "Hey, it's a slam dunk. I'm going to necessarily do that work." It's a case by case basis,
Right.
and I would need to know more about the nature of the work. The as we talk about pricing models, also that's going to play into it as well. Every pricing model is going to dictate how that scope looks and how I would engage with a client.
Yeah, I totally respect that, Mike. But I would say if I was in the game right now, I mean, I'm currently not a city manager, but if I was, I would find a way to work with you, Mike, just to get that street smart tuition You know what I mean? As far as skill set of like, what are you looking for? And just sort of beef up my understanding and my expertise, because I know I'm personally deficient in a lot of ways when it comes to construction management and that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? That's just not my wheelhouse. So I would be looking for ways to try to network and get involved with hiring you, not only to help my organization and make sure that we're being prudent with tax dollars, but also for my own personal professional benefit education. So before we get into what I really, 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 really want to talk about, and that's all the hustles and scams that can get played, why don't we talk real quick about the different types of pricing models and contracts that you see vendors enter into, and you can kind of maybe lay out the pros and cons of each for the folks who are listening.
So there are a lot of different pricing models. I'm going to talk about the basic ones, and I'm going to break down. I'm not going to use acronyms and whatnot. Some folks on these calls, this is going to be some basics and some not for some people. Your reimbursable contracts are the ones that are usually they're advantageous for the customer, client, owner of the project. However, they come with risks. Okay, so let's start out with time and material contract. So a time and material contract, essentially what you're doing here, this is advantageous for the owner of the project for a number of reasons, but it does come with a risk. So a time and material contract is you're going to buy some craft's time. So you're going to hire a contractor, general mechanical, electrical, plumbing, whatever it may be, and you're going to hire each of their crafts out at a certain rate. Now, when you negotiate a time and material contract, a properly negotiated time and material contract has a labor rate buildup. This is not done well by people. So, what do I mean by that? A labor rate buildup has certain components within it. And within that is the straight time billing rate. So, if they are paying their people, let's say $25 an hour, on top of that, they have FICA, FUI, and SUI. So these are unemployment insurance, healthcare, whatnot. There are certain things that are put on top of that. You've got general liability, you've got workman's comp, health fringes, overhead and profit. All of these things get lumped into what's called that total markup. So when you go through all those things, FICA, FUI, SUI, general liability, workman's comp, health fringes, overhead, profit, all that gets to your billable rate. So from there, let's say it's $25 per hour, maybe that gets jacked up to, you know, maybe 30 some dollars per hour. So let's say it's, I don't know, $38 per hour. So that's what you get billed. But the main context here is when you have a properly negotiated time and material contract, you have transparency. And this is
Right.
you usually
Through all
don't
those
get this
components, all those
for all those
inputs. Yeah.
components, and you can audit to that. So here, a good thing to talk about here is SUI, and I talk about this as a blog I had it maybe about a month or two ago on my website about SUI. So state unemployment insurance that caps out most states at around 7 grand. And so if you think about it, so if I hire, let's say if I hire you, Joe, and you're working at my facility, let's say I hire you to do general maintenance for some asset in the town, and I hire you and I'm paying you hourly. And basically, let's say that you are a contract employee of the city and you work 20 hours a week, and I paid you that complete buildup all year long. Well, at some point early in the year, that component actually goes away because it's no longer a cost burden to the contractor at some point. That goes away. That $7,000 caps out somewhere in the spring usually. So at that point in time, you should see a reduction in that labor rate, right? Because it's no longer cost burden. That actually now gets converted to what's to their profit. So there is a component of that labor rate buildup, which is the profit of the contractor. Their profit is a certain percentage. When you negotiate that correctly, you have transparency to every percentage of each of those different areas and those line items. And there is a certain, and I'm not going to get into it, but there is for each different type of craft and in the regions, there's a certain range that you should be paying on top of that base rate. So typically it's somewhere between 30 and 50%, depending on what the craft is of base rate. That's usually what you should be paying. So that's something that I used to test for. I would look for based on what area of spend it is, whether or not it was in market. So that's how you test whether or not someone is actually billing you at market. And then you have overtime and whatnot. And you have to make sure those are calculated correctly as well. So you have overtime and then you have double time. But at any rate, that's how time material works. So you would see an invoice that would say, hey, I got Joe Turner, 20 hours a week, and he replaced air filters in a school. Maybe that's what you were working on. So you've got the air filters, you got the line item for the air filters, you got the backup receipt for the air filters, you see where they were purchased at the Home Depot or wherever, and then there's a markup. So then the contractor charges you a markup. So
Like 15%, right? You pay $100 for filters, or you get tacked on
15's high.
15.
15's high. All right, so we'll talk about markups here. So a lot of people try to charge 15.
Yeah.
I've seen a range of outcomes, and I've heard people talk about it. Well, if you're a really big contractor, you need to charge a really high markup. Not true at all. The larger you are, the more you actually have a say in driving down that markup. So here's a really simple example. So if I'm a mom and pop outfit, is let's say you've got a warehouse and you've got a guard shack out front and you've got the warehouse in the back. And let's say it's a climate controlled warehouse. So you've got the guard shack out front. Maybe they've got a 2-ton air conditioning unit for that little guard shack. So you call in a mom and pop air conditioning outfit and they come in and they tell you, hey, we'll replace that for, $7,000 plus $3,000 for our labor and, 10% on top of that 7,000 for buying the unit. A lot of HVAC contractors won't charge you that way, but for the purpose of this example, let's say that they're getting a 10% markup on that $7,000. However, then you have a very large commercial air handling outfit that's going to replace the 50-ton units on the roof. And let's say that they end up being $1 million in cost. Now, it's a phone call. It probably requires a little bit more than that. I know we talked on the last call about, markups are to compensate for the burden of actually going in and acquiring or procuring those materials and that equipment. So if I've got $1 million in materials I'm procuring and I've got $7,000, that phone call might be 15 minutes longer, or maybe it's an extra couple emails. But if you're paying somebody 10% here, 10% there, you're paying somebody $100,000 for the commercial units, and you're paying
Right.
somebody, $700 for the one that's out the guard shack. So my point is,
It's almost reverse economy of scale in a
it
sense,
is.
but
It is.
yeah.
Smaller contractors actually need a larger markup
Yeah.
in order to stay profitable. But so if you have a very large outfit and they tell you they need 15%, that's just not true. The markup should be much lower. I've seen some markups low as 5. I've seen some shoot for the heavens, and then if I get wind of it and I see it before it gets agreed to, then I'd stop it. But
Yeah.
when you start talking like 15%, that's you really start to need to do something special. 10%
Okay.
is usually about the average. 10 to 15%, somewhere in that range is the average. I've seen, like I said, 5, 7, but you have to do a lot of business with those people. So it varies. Each industry is different. So I don't want to necessarily pin anybody on any. In my example in the HVAC, that's just me putting numbers out there. That's not specific to that industry. Each industry is unique.
And what about time and material not to exceed?
So the difference here is and this is something that a lot of people have a lot of misnomers around. So if you have a time and material contract, what that basically says is, hey, we agree that we really don't have a really well-defined scope. We don't know where the end is. This may go in perpetuity. I'm not going to hold either party to a fixed fee, fixed amount, or basically a closeout amount, an amount that's guaranteed or a maximum amount. We may have a purchase order. We say, you know what, we'll start out at $100,000. And then when we get up to $100,000, we'll reassess and maybe we'll, increase it another $100,000. So like a good example would be like a research and development project. You really don't know how long it's going to go. It's just going to keep going and it's going and it's going. Or if you're like those guys trying to find gold out on what's that island? That's that show. If you're trying to find, they're just going to keep throwing money at that, right? So that's just going to go in perpetuity. When are they going to find that gold? Probably never, but they're going to keep throwing money at it. So they understand that the scope is not going to end at it's not going to end in the short term. So they're just going to keep throwing money at that.
So what's the risk with the not to exceed amount type contract here?
So you're shifting the risk to the contractor. So T&M, it has risk for the owner in inefficiency. So this is why you'll hear a lot of project managers say, "Oh, I like doing lump sum. I like doing lump sum," because they're going to say that we're incentivizing, and this is true. You incentivize the contractor to get it done efficiently and quickly. Why? Because they maximize profit.
Right, because if they have a lump sum amount of say $200,000 and they can get it done for 180, then they pocket 20,000, right? Essentially.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the premise here is, and this is we can go down a whole rabbit hole with this. With lump sums, You're going to hear project managers, construction managers, they love that because it's the easy button. They don't have to be going after people. They don't have to say, hey, break time's over. What's going on? Why are we over here? The burden is on the folks in the field to make sure that you're getting efficient use of labor, right? That's the risk that the owner has when you do a T&M contract. But the benefit is if you run it very tight, that you can actually control costs better. But you have to have the right people in the field to make sure that that's occurring. So that's really the requirement.
Let me ask you this question though: do you run the risk on a time and materials with a not to exceed amount, where the vendor might cut corners or shave off quality because they're trying to max?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So on a not to exceed, what that says is, hey, we're doing T&M. However, as long as that scope remains the same, that base scope remains anchored, it doesn't change. If we set it at $100,000, I'm going to pay you $100,000, and I can compel you to finish the project for $100,000. Problem is, a lot of companies condition their vendors and their contractors that change orders are acceptable. So if contract language does not matter to your organization, they're going to figure that out real quick, and they're just going to keep coming back asking for more money, and that happens. That's a problem. But you can contractually obligate people. That's why you want to have a defined scope. I don't care what pricing model you use. A lump sum, you have got to have an ironclad scope. That's why if someone tells you I like doing lump sum all the time, that's just a bogus answer. You don't want to do that. I guarantee you there are scopes that you have that are not well defined and it will get you into trouble. And good examples of this are when you have unknowns in the ground. Anytime you're digging in the ground, you should almost never do a lump sum. You could do unit costs. That's like linear feet for this or that. But then again, let's think about that for a minute. Let's say I'm running pipe somewhere and I'm running sewer pipe. What's the difference between running sewer pipe on a mountain in Colorado in a small mountain town versus a flat, sandy part near the beach? It's going to be a lot easier digging in the sand. It's going to be a lot harder digging in the rock. And the linear price per foot is going to vary greatly based on that project. Or versus, a new city versus New York City. I'm going to find all kinds of stuff in that street. So when you have unknowns, you want to more or less do those T&M. You do not want it. You can do unit costs to an extent, but you're most advantageous doing it T&M as long as you can run that tight. And the reason is you don't know what you're going to find. Good example, years ago there was a construction project. That was a huge expansion project that I kind of got involved in. And when you do that, you have to do soils testing. So you have to know whether or not the soil can bear the load of what you're going to put on it. So typically what you do is core samples. So you do a grid and you lay it out and you do all your core samples. And in this project, they just happened to set up a matrix of core samples that missed this giant monolith of concrete that was on no drawings. It wasn't on a drawing because it predated the facility. It probably went back to the 1940s. No one knew it was there.
Nothing nefarious about this. This wasn't
nothing nefarious. It just was what it was. But it was actually a contract that people were lobbying for making it lump sum. And that would have really mucked up the works because you had a 2-week delay. There were people, I think, even talk about dynamiting. It was so big. But then you have all this disruption of dirt. So once you disrupt dirt, you have to compact. You have to let it age. Sometimes you let it rain on it. So there were lots of downstream effects to the project. All of them affected cost. But when you do something that you have a substantial or you have a lot of unknowns, you really need to think about that. You have to, if you have a project that's got a lot of known unknowns, which is going to eat into your contingency. And in that project, I think the contingency was blown from day one. It was all lost there with this finding in the ground. When you find stuff, it could go anywhere. So if you have a lump sum, how do you know where you're at? How do you understand what the true impact and cost is, or what the increase to the project should be? It's very tough to do that. If you have a project that goes what's called open book to close book, where you have transparency on the front end and you understand those costs and you build up those costs and you do your work breakdown structure and you load up the project, you understand what the estimate of completion is going to be, and then you say, hey, we're going to close the book now. This is the fixed price. You could do stuff like that, but you still have that the risk of finding these unknowns as you go. So it's very important to understand that the pricing model should be more reflective of the project and not the needs and wants of the project team. Now, those need to play into it. You need to be honest with yourself. And for instance, let's say you've got a project that has a very poorly written scope. You've got a bad scope. You've got a lot of unknowns, and you have a deficiency of project managers with a high level of experience. That's a bad place to be. And you need to really rethink, do you have to do that project first and foremost? Can you actually push it off until you have greener pastures? Or do we need to rethink how we do that? Do we need to have experienced resources that we're going to have as contractors working with this project to make sure that we don't have it go into the ditch?
That's a great point, Mike. The idea of not only when you're assessing the need or viability of the project itself, but do you have the in-house talent to complete this project in a way that is going to provide good value to the taxpayers and not turn into an albatross, right?
Exactly. It's one thing that we didn't talk about this too much, but when you do RFPs, the one thing that I always harp on is total cost of ownership. And I know this is different in municipalities. A lot of people just do the three bids and a buy, right? You look for that
Right.
lowest cost. Well, I always anchor on what's the lowest cost alternative or option, and put it in simplistic terms. You don't necessarily just go out and buy a Hyundai versus a Mercedes. There's reasons why you'd buy a Hyundai or Mercedes. If you buy it always because it's cheaper, you're not always getting the best value. So you really
Right.
need to assess what is the best overall value. Someone may be delivering for you an asset that's going to last twice as long. That may has a lot of value. You always need to be wary of the low bid. And there's a lot of people that bid low to change order high.
I was
Big
just
problem.
gonna say that's what we hate that. Well, I should say we. I mean, I know a lot of people really. That just drives us insane because you're confident that you're going to get screwed on the low bid because they're gaming it out, and they know they can kind of wear you down on the back end with the change orders, and then there you go. They've once you put in a 1, 2, 3 change orders, it's already past whatever the other bids were.
It's a huge problem. And I can tell you, I've got lots of examples with change orders run amok, or change orders where contractors are trying to come back and change order where they messed up. Very big one I had years ago was during a major maintenance event. And I had a customer in the field reach out to me and say, help, help, help. We've got a contractor that's trying to change order several $100,000. Went from, I don't know, something like $500,000, whatever, $1 million, probably all said and done. And it's a lump sum. Shouldn't have been lump sum. It was one of those type deals where they didn't think they had the resources to manage it appropriately. That's one of the reasons they did this. And that goes back to that. Should you do it? Can you do it a different way? You got to think about that. And in this case, I said, well, let me see what we can do. It was inclement weather delays. So the contractor said that you delayed us because we had to stand down. And in fact, it got to a point where I even got on a call with the contractor, and the contractor's complaining, well, you told us to stand down. And I said, well, sir, all due respect, are we going to play chicken with people on a metal structure in the middle of the open during an electrical storm? I think not. I think it's prudent to have people off that structure. But anyway, we were going back and forth. And, this was one of those situations where I went to a manager on my team and I said, hey, you know what? We've got good access gate data. So if most facilities, you have security, right? So you have people that badge in, badge out, who's there. That's just something that most basic blocking and tackling, most anyone does. So I said, well, this is a lump sum contract. Let's look back at the quote. So we looked at the quote that the contractor gave us, and they actually estimated the hours that they were going to be on site in order to complete that base scope for a certain amount of hours, right? So that was that 500. Let's pretend it was $500,000. It was somewhere in that range, but let's say it was $500,000. So that contractor was giving us a quote with X amount of labor to finish it for around $500,000, and they're coming back and they want $1 million because we
Because of
delayed
the
them so
weather, right?
much
The weather
because of the
delays,
weather.
right? Yeah.
So we went back and we looked at the estimated hours they were supposed to spend on site. Well, when we did the math, they actually spent, I think it was supposed to be like something like, it was a lot of hours, like 8,000 hours. They ended up spending like 7,000 hours or something on site. So they didn't even exhaust the time that they originally quoted for the original amount on site.
Even counting the
Yeah,
weather delays and everything,
even
right?
counting the weather
Yeah.
delays.
Yeah.
So we went back and said, all due respect, there's no cost burden here to you. You factored this into your price. So these were people that wanted that much profit that they were shooting for the fences, and they were hoping that somebody would just accept it.
And
And we
and stamp off on it, right?
stamp
Essentially.
off on it. Yep.
You're right. We had a wet spring. You're right.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something, I'm glad you brought that up. So that's something that, and if anyone tells you, hey, you know what? We've got significant weather delays. If it's a project of note, a very large project, contractors that are worth their weight, they're going to look at the Farmer's Almanac. Now, if you're doing work in the Southeast in the spring, guess what's going to happen? Bad weather events. So you need to know how many down days you're going to have if you're going to do a lump sum. So you want to factor that in. So the most contractors that know what they're doing, they're going to factor that in. So they come back to you and say, "Oh, we had 5 bad weather events." You could go back and say, "Well, according to the Farmer's Almanac, we should have had 10. So you didn't even factor in for the 10? Why are we even talking about 5?"
Right.
So that's how you need to approach those types of things. That's how I typically like to approach those things. Contractors that know what they're doing, they know to factor those things into a lump sum fee.
But I'm not confident that a lot of these contractors are getting that aggressive pushback from public sector officials. I think I'm sure there's always exceptions, and I'm sure there's some out there who are really diligent about it. But I think that's why it gets back to me wanting to have you on this podcast, is because I don't think a lot of the government agencies are really pushing back on these vendors and contractors on aspects of this equation. What about cost plus guaranteed maximum price? Do we want to talk about that?
Oh yeah. So that's anyone that does the type of work I do or has been very experienced, long lived in contracting, knows that that is the most advantageous for a owner of a project, being the customer that's
You
having
mean
that
like
asset
the
built.
government agency would
So that
want
would
to?
be the government
Okay.
agency, it'd be a fact whoever is actually commissioning the construction of that
Okay.
asset. They are most advantaged by doing a cost plus GMP. And the way that these work, it's actual costs. So if your W-2 says you made $45,000 on my project because you were working there the entire year, I'm paying you $45,000. And then you've got the materials, you got the equipment. So it's based on actual costs. So you're going to actually audit payroll. So a lot of times these require an audit to get the most value from them, because you need to audit payroll. You need to understand what the true payroll cost was and the cost of that contractor. And this goes back to another thing I was going to want to talk about, which is travel expense. So contractors take a huge advantage of that. But actual costs, you need to have all your receipts substantiating what the actual cost of the project were. Then you have a fixed fee. So let's pretend we've got $100,000 guaranteed max price, cost plus project. So let's say that the contractor thinks that the costs are going to be 85,000 and their fixed fee is going to be 15,000. The guaranteed max price is 100. Now they're probably going to put some buffer in there. So right, they're going to want to make sure that they're getting their profits. So let's say maybe they think it's going to be like 80 and they got $20,000 in the fixed fee, and they'll be happy if they get $12,000 or $13,000 from it, if there's some overages there that they can't manage. As long as that scope remains the same and it's anchored and it's not changing, you can compel the contractor to finish it for that amount. So that what that means is they still have to substantiate all their costs. But if they have overruns, if they have inefficiencies, you're forcing them, much like a lump sum now, they have to get it done for that price because they're eating into their profit and they're only going to get paid that $100,000. That's why it's most advantageous for if you're the owner. However, it still requires some oversight. You have to have a very strong scope in order for that to be advantageous, because as soon as your scope starts to slip and you've got other ads or you've got
You're
other
exposed.
unknowns,
You've exposed yourself to
you
the
have some
whirlwind,
potential
right?
exposure. Yep. But you still have you have a much better foundation to really understand what those costs are when you're working with a cost plus contract.
Okay, and you've talked about lump sum here and there throughout this whole conversation, but why don't you just expand on that and just sort of summarize where we stand with the lump sum, and then at the end of that, can you basically go over all 4 of these again and kind of summarize them?
And then the lump sum, so your fixed price, contractor is going to do something for $100,000. How much profit they have, none of your business. That's how that works. So if you bid it out, they happen to be the low one, you don't know. It's as long as they're doing the work for that amount of money, you may be content with it, but you don't really know how much profit they
It's
really
like a
have.
black box, right?
It's a black box. Yep. You got to pay to see those cards, so to speak. You really don't know. So you don't really have transparency. So that's the disadvantage with the lump sum. The advantage is if you have a very tight scope and it does not deviate, you can
And
compel.
Mike, and a step on you, Mike, and that's why
No, no,
you run into a lot of issues if you don't have a good scope or understand all the risks, because the lump sum is going to get blown out the window when you got to do a change order, essentially, right?
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And you don't know where you're at. So as soon as, like, if you, for instance, you have a project that you've got a lot of unknowns and they start coming in, you got change order after change order after change order after change order, you're going to get lost. You're going to be like, Jack Nicholson at the end of The Shining in that maze. You're not going to know your way out. You're not going to understand which way's up. You're not going to know where your costs are.
It kind of reminds me. I don't know if you ever saw Las Vegas Vacation with Chevy
Yeah,
Chase, where he goes
yep.
into the guess the number game or something.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. You
Because
you
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 don't
really
know.
yeah,
You don't know how they factor in the cost of anything, right? It's all black
exactly.
box. Yeah.
It's all
Okay.
black box, and you're taking their word for it. Then you really have to get into the weeds then and try to understand what the true costs are. I've done a lot of those exercises. I've done that. I've got experience doing it. I can kind of get people out of the a bad place to be if they find themselves in that situation. It's not a great place to operate. Like I just described, I figured out a way to challenge that contractor on a lump sum. If you get creative and you have enough data points available to you, you can kind of triangulate what the cost is, and then you can come up with a plan of attack to challenge and say, hey, I don't think your number is reasonable.
But think about all the effort and energy and stuff you got to put into that, because you put yourself at a disadvantage by getting into the wrong arrangement, because you're playing catch up at that point. So
Exactly.
so to summarize, the best option for nearly every situation, if you can get the vendors to agree to it, is going to be cost plus the guaranteed maximum price, right?
Yep.
And then the worst case potentially is going to be that lump sum, if you do not have, unless you have a really laser focused, confined scope, defined scope, or whatnot, right?
Yep. And there's good
Okay.
examples for lump sums. I mean, don't get me wrong. I've worked with some people that on my side of the fence and say T&M, 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 and I'm like, no, you shouldn't always do T&M. That you can get yourself into trouble with T&M, just like you can get yourself into trouble with lump sum. That's why I kind of harp back on anybody that tells you we need to do lump sum because we get the best value. That's just a bogus answer. You don't want that. Someone needs to tell you, well, I think we need to do this lump sum because Joe and Sally are best project managers, or they're out sick, or they're not going to be available, or hey, someone just gave notice and we're not going to have the resources to manage this. However, I think if we spend some time, we button up our scope, I think we can really refine it, really anchor it. And then if we put out a really good RFP, we do a really good bid evaluation, we really assess the TCO, we could probably do this reasonable and probably bring it in within budget. We could feel confident about it. There are times that's what you want to do. That's the kind of conversation you want to have. If somebody just tells you, well, we have to do lump sum, we don't have people that can watch it, that's not the right answer. The right answer is, what did we do to make sure that that's going to be a successful outcome for us and we're not going to get change orders? So that's
Awesome.
what you need to think about.
Awesome. Okay, Mike. So let's get into my favorite part of this conversation I want to have. I want you to pull back the covers, pull back the curtains. I want you to reveal all the secret tricks and little cons and hustles that these vendors will do to order to work over a local government agency when they're working on these projects. And you start, peel it back, let it rip.
There's quite a few. Just to kind of wet everyone's whistle for this, if you go on my website, you'll see that there is a potential when I do invoice review. So, like I say, someone on my team that does an invoice review for a client, we're going through your payment application from your vendor. There's technically, between the invoice itself and if we were to go on site and do any audit procedures, if necessary, or even site procedures in the field, there's up to 200 areas that we would consider for a potential overage on an invoice. There's that many areas that someone can potentially overcharge you. So if we talk about labor, labor is one of those things where there's a lot of opportunities. There's some tools out there. There's actually some commercially available tools that are used mostly in the private sector for managing labor. So, I talked about like badging activity. So you can do your own. If you have badging activity of people coming in and out of a site, you can manage it that way. There are other platforms that are available out there to help you manage that. Labor is a huge, huge, huge area for overbilling. You have phantom labor, people that don't exist. So when you sign off on a timesheet, this is something you really need to think about. And I can tell you, I can give you many examples where contractors will take advantage of timesheets not being filled out properly or being filled out in their advantage and having somebody sign off on it. You really need to watch what you sign off on very carefully. I had a situation several years back where we had no timesheets on a time and material contract that were signed off by our people in the field. Someone on my team pushes back. And this was a learning for us as a team, because what ended up happening is the contractor went back into our facility. And this was a very inexperienced project manager, really hadn't done a lot of work overseeing a lot of projects. And this happened several months later. The contractor had them sign timesheets for work that happened several months earlier. And once that happens, you're bound. You had somebody that's a representative of the company signing off on that timesheet, and it was a learning for that individual. It was a learning for us as a team. Is how we push for that, and it's something you always need to be careful of what you're signing. And in some cases, if you have badging activity, you're most advantageous to rely on that. So if you have like a camera or you have badging activity, that would be advantageous to negotiate with the vendor or to let them know that we're going to be using our data to validate labor coming on and off our site, because you'll have contractors try to nickel and dime you for anything.
Yeah. And you probably want to have language in the contract that states who's authorized to sign off on certain activity, correct?
Yes, but I could tell you straight up, any representative, so anybody so in private, and it's probably the same in the municipal sector as well, anyone who represents that constituency could be necessarily someone. So, for instance, I could have signed off on any invoice when I worked for Georgia Pacific because I was a representative of the company. Had I signed off on it, even though I didn't have oversight of that work, I could have compelled the company to pay for it. So you always have to, and I always do this whenever I talk to a potential client or someone that I'm trying to help, and they say, help, 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 contractor wants to overcharge me. I kind of always say, well, what did you do? And that's kind of code for, well, what did you sign? What did you agree to? What did you say that someone could have overheard? When you sign off on things, people I've seen like change orders be on a single piece of paper. Hey, you agree to this $200,000. Somebody just signs off on it. You're committed. You've just agreed to that. And I always say to people, be careful what you email. Be careful what you text. Any of those things could be construed as you agreeing to something. That could be additional labor. It could be additional materials. It could be anything. And there's a lot of case studies where change orders get just willy-nilly approved by somebody just hand waving something. So people don't realize the effects of, when in doubt, always back away from a situation like that. And I always tell people in the field, and I always offered this service when I was a GP. I'd say to people, I say, hey, if you find yourself in a situation where a contractor is pressuring you to sign off on something that you're not sure, call me up. I'll have somebody on my team review your contract, review the base scope, and determine whether or not you should be approving that change order. And that's something that I offer to my clients as well. If I'm engaging with them on a project, most of these are ongoing. So if, let's say, I get a call from a customer and they say, hey, we got a problem here. We've got a contractor that's pressuring us saying, hey, we've got people that are mobilized here. What do we do? They're saying, hey, what do you want me to do? Sit here idle, or we got to do something here? This is in my way. I got to move it. It's a change order. So those are things that I could help clients with. And I typically did that. Something you need to be cognizant of, whatever you sign off on. But back to labor, labor is one of those things where you have a lot of opportunities with overtime. Like, for instance, sometimes contractors will try to charge you overtime in excess, and then we'll time out. Why are you charging me overtime? Now, some unions, they'll have some handshake agreements, say, hey, we're going to get 10% overtime or whatever. We're going to get an extra hour a day, blah, blah, blah. That happens. You need to have some transparency to that. But for the most part, if you're seeing overtime and you didn't agree to that, and if you've put it out for bid, and the expectation is that you want it done on straight time, as long as you don't have an actual shift in the scope or there's some undue slip in the schedule, why are you running overtime? You need to ask that question. You need to challenge that, because I've seen many times where people will put through overtime. They'll start charging overtime, and then I'll say to them, well, why am I seeing overtime? Oh, well, we've got a project down the street with so and so. And I'll say, well, how's that my fault? Why are you
Right.
charging me the overtime because you don't have enough people to work for you? So you need to think about that. Why are you being charged overtime? So contractors will try to sneak that in as well. Something you need to think about.
I would imagine even miscoding or coding the wrong employee or the wrong hourly rate too is another
Oh
issue as
yeah.
well.
Oh yeah. Well, this is, while we're talking about it, I've got one other thing. I've seen this happen, and I'm not going to dime out anybody on this, but this is something that you need to be concerned with. If you hire a general contractor, I've seen on a few occasions now where they'll try to sneak in subcontractor employees and bill them out as fully burdened employees of their own when they're not. The effects of this are, let's say, just for talking purposes, the subcontractor is really, their folks are getting paid $25 and they're charging you $50. If you get wind, or you have any reason to believe that those are not employees of that contractor, you need to challenge and say, I need to see the invoice for the subcontractor, because that's how you should be being charged for that subcontractor. You should see the invoice from the subcontractor for the hours, because I guarantee you that GC is getting that. So that's something you need to be concerned with. Travel time. This is something that you see. I saw this just last year. Some contractor was telling us that their people were traveling 3 hours each way every day. And we were just like, no, that's just not happening. We just don't believe that's happening. I've seen circumstances where contractors have tried to charge for drive time, and they're charging also mileage reimbursement for their vehicles. And when I did the math. This is where I challenge. This was a situation a few years back, and this was actually someone trying to defraud the company. And I caught this, and they were saying that every person drove their car to the site, every single person. And I did the math. It was probably twice the amount in automotive reimbursement than if everyone flew from their cities where they were actually living. So I went back to the contractor and I said, well, you've got all these change orders. You're trying to hit us with change orders left and right. And I can just pretty much prove that it would have been in our advantage if you had people fly at least $200,000. I forget what the number was, but it was a few $100,000. I said, why would we do this? And I
Right.
challenged it, and I was able to negotiate down from the bill. But you have to think about that. Are they operating in your best interests, or are they just doing what taxi drivers do, just keep driving around in circles? So, are they doing something that's in your best interest? So that's
Right.
something that you always want to think about. How are they managing their labor? They have lots of overtime, phantom labor. Labor is a huge black hole for contractor overcharging.
What about charging for mileage in excess of the IRS rate? Is that legal? I guess is it? I mean, how does
Well,
that work?
it's not illegal, so you could do it. I mean, and I've seen it on
As long as you
contracts.
disclose it.
Yeah, as long as you disclose it on your rate sheet, but you got to catch it. If I see it, I stop it, and I say no, 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 no. I want to see your rate sheet with IRS written on there. I want to see IRS mileage per IRS guidelines. That's what you want to see on your time sheets or your rate sheets in your contracts. So if you're going to do time and material, you want to see per IRS guidelines. Contractor, this is what they'll tell me. I'll say, well, they'll try to charge $1 an hour or $1 per mile. And I say, well, that's not IRS. We don't compensate you profit for your employees. That's a direct reimbursement to them. Then I'll say, well,
Right.
you reimbursing them $1 per mile? And obviously you're calling
They're
them out
not.
for the additional
Yeah.
profit that they're making off that.
Yep.
So usually you can guilt people into it if it gets into your contract. It's something I've tried to negotiate out after. I've been successful with it, but it's most advantageous to find it before you agree to it in your contract. That's what you want to do.
Well, and I mean, it's fair to say a lot of vendors are going to ask for forgiveness instead of permission, right? When they get
Yeah,
caught with the hand in the
they,
cookie
they
jar.
try. They
Yeah.
fish. Like back to like I said in the last call, the velociraptors. They're going to test the fences and find out what they can get away with.
What about shop time?
Okay, so that's something you want to think about. I challenge here a lot. Shop time is a black hole for you. You don't know what's going on when they say, "Oh, we got shop time." Do you have the need for shop time within your scope? That's something you need to ask. And I ask that of contractors. When I see a exorbitant amount of shop time, my question is going to be, could you explain to me what was required in the shop? And I'll actually go to I'll go to before, if I know I've got an invoice approver, a project manager that's not really watching the shop well, I'll ask them even before I tell them about the invoice. I'll go to that person and say, "Hey, what's going on in the shop? What are they working on in the shop?" And then I'll hear, I don't know. Well, they're charging you a lot of hours for shop time that we've been approving. You might want to know what they're doing because we're paying a lot of money for it. So that's something you need to think about. That is one of those areas where they just try to hide stuff. Now there is some needs if you're going to be fabricating stuff. If you're doing a lot of metal fab work, there may be some need for that, but it needs to be reasonable, and you need to be able to explain it. They need to be able to explain it to you as exactly what that shop time is for and what is being done.
Now, what about materials? I have some thoughts on materials, but I want to give you a chance to riff on it first before I throw my thoughts in there.
Oh, there's tons with materials. So one of the first frauds I found was several $100,000, and it was actually a subcontractor that rolled up to a GC, and because they were such a substantial portion of the contract, they themselves were compelled by the contract to submit reimbursable support. So what they did was, this was like a lot of ductwork that was being bought out. So they bought out from another company all this ductwork, and they layered in invoices for $300,000 worth of materials, and then they layered in sales orders that looked like invoices at the same time. So it looked like double the materials were purchased. So I looked at it and I noticed that it looked like double the materials. So I got concerned immediately. So I put it into an Excel spreadsheet, footed it, put them side by side, and noted that they had different totals, which also made it easy for this fraud to occur. And the reason that it had a different total is I looked at it, there was a down payment that was reflected. So when I went back to our project manager, I said, "Well, did we do this twice?" And the answer back was no. I said, "Well, we're paying for it twice." And that was uncovered. Then it became we were actually paying and compensating that GC to vet that for us, because the subcontractor submits the invoice to them. They were supposed to vet it before they sent it to us. So we went back to that contractor and said, "Hey, we've got a problem here. You're overcharging us for all these materials that you should have vetted for your subcontractor. What gives?" It was actually an interesting one. And this is another good item. Like I talk about how I operate. I remember this conversation very well. The contractor goes, "Oh, well, I bet you wouldn't tell me when I underbilled you." I said, "Oh, well, okay, sir. Did you get the Excel file I gave you? Okay, go to this tab, go to line 26, see where I gave you a credit for $8,000 that you undercharged me, right there." And the guy got quiet. So what this business, it really helps when you're honest, forthright, and you try to do right by both parties. That's
Right.
why, my approach is earlier better. Show, light. The light is the best disinfectant. The earlier you work, the better outcome you're going to have.
So materials can be as simple as straight up theft, essentially, right? You're basically,
Oh yeah.
doubling up or whatever. You can also bill out for, say, the Cadillac of equipment, but provide the Pinto quality of
Hmm.
equipment, right? As far as the
Yep.
substandard materials. How else? What other games get played with materials in this regard?
So there's other things with materials that you need to consider. So, for instance, in some cases, like in the private sector, if you do a very large project, you buy out a lot of the stuff yourself. So there are companies that will offer, large companies like GP or Koch Industries. They'll say, "Hey, you know what? If you give us the BOM for the bill of materials for your project, we'll give you a price that's cheaper than what we will give it to for the contractors to buy directly from us, and you can forego having that markup." Now, I've actually audited some of these, and believe it or not, they're getting money off that too. People that sell it directly to you,
Wait, let me see if I
but
understand this correctly. So you're saying that the organization can go straight to the vendor and buy it, as
but
opposed
yeah,
to
you could buy it from the manufacturer. So if you buy it directly from, it's not necessarily the manufacturer. You could buy from a supply house. Some very
right?
large supply houses, be it electrical, plumbing, whatever, they will sell directly. It's a dicey place to be. You
Yeah,
can you can buy it outright, but you're circumventing the contractor. So you're taking that middleman out. They get upset. So if you're requiring them to create the bomb for you, that's where it kind of gets touchy.
got you.
However, the other risk that you've got is that when you buy that stuff out yourself, you're saving the money of having the markup. You buy it directly, but now you have care, custody, and ownership. So this is another service that I provide. I've got a lot of experience with site security around a laydown yard. So where you secure those materials and how you requisition those materials. Because if you are the entity that buys them, you have title to them. When you have a contractor that procures stuff on your behalf, you don't take title until they actually install it at
Right.
your facility. That's when it's a liability to you, and that's when they charge you for it. So if it gets stolen and they have care, custody, of ownership, and they bought it, you could say you have to make sure you're not paying for it, because that's another thing you need to be concerned with. I've caught that in the past too, where they try to double charge you for stuff that they lost. But once they have ownership of it, that's why it's advantageous sometimes for them to take the burden of having the ownership of that piece. However, but if you do that because you want to save the money from paying that markup, you need to think about how you have care, custody, and ownership, because things disappear. Anybody that's watched any episode of Sopranos, you know how that happens. So that's something you need to always be concerned with.
I do have a observation. It kind of falls into the substandard materials, I guess, to a degree. But how often do you see games played? Because I've had sort of like the gnawing feeling that a vendor might put in a bid for component X or component Y, and then come times you get to the job site, they want to switch it out to a different type of component, which might just happen to be a little cheaper, but it's actually better for the project upon further review or something. How often do games like that get played?
Often. And I can tell you, it's probably harder to get away with in municipal projects, because you have requirements that you have to have conflict-free sourcing. Things that are bought produced, manufactured in the U.S. to certain. There's a lot more constraints put around this. There's a lot more risk. They're going to be more transparent. They're going to say it's just as good, and you're going to have to get somebody, either an engineer or someone, to sign off on it that says that it is fit for purpose and that's not a deficient in nature. However, what you want to be most concerned with, the thing that really keeps me up at night is, like, for instance, we'll do a demo project, right? You demo something and you rebuild something, and you go back, in the as built drawing said you're supposed to have 6 inches of concrete. You demo it, you found out you only had 4. Now, It didn't end life, it didn't fail, but you find out that you got shortchanged. So those are the things that I would be more concerned. It's a lot easier to skimp on 5 inches of concrete than something that's right there in your face where you're
Right.
supposed to have an energy efficient window in a building. You know whether it is or it isn't. So
Fair enough. Fair
it's
enough.
it's you know it's you it's the things that you can't see. Like for instance, there's people that go around, they do building inspections of residential construction, and they'll have a heat gun, and they'll look for people that didn't put insulation in between stud bays. That's a common fraud. People will not insulate walls properly. And
Right.
then you'll see that. You'll see the heat signature where there's obviously no insulation in the wall. So I'm always more concerned with the things that you bury and that you don't see. Those are the things that can haunt you downstream of the project when a concrete fails, or it was they used insufficient materials, or the metallurgy was not up to spec. That's
Right.
that's those are the things that I get more concerned with, but it's a concern all across the board, and it's always a concern on lump sum, because once if you push on a contractor hard and you hold them to that price, and they're losing that profitability. And this is something you always want to be worried about. I'm glad I just thought of this. You never want to have a contractor doing a reimbursable contract and a fixed price lump sum contract at the same time at your location. Why? Because if the lump sum is now at risk and they've underbid it, they can overcharge you and they could change order you on the T&M contract, and you'd never know it, and you can't bifurcate out unless you had two good, strong project managers that were running very tight labor records and understanding who was working on what project and what, when, where. You need to have that. Very common fraud. I see that very often.
What about equipment? What kind of games do they play with the equipment?
They park it on your site and they don't use it. This is something that you either don't own it. So this would require going on site and doing an audit of their asset register to make sure that they actually own the asset that they say that they're renting to you. Phantom equipment like labor. Is it actually there, or are they actually using it? When I look at a payment package, an application for payment, I also look to see reasonableness as to whether or not the people that were there, are they even qualified to operate the equipment? Or like for instance, let's make it real simple. Let's say you've got 10 pieces of welding equipment. So you've got 10 MIG welders and you've got 5 electricians and 3 plumbers. More than likely, they weren't using 10 welders that day. So I do a lot of reasonableness testing when I do this for clients. I look at that mix of that ratio of equipment to labor pool, and I look to see whether or not it makes sense and it's reasonable in nature, and whether or not they could have actually even used the equipment that they say they're charging me for. The other thing that you need to be concerned with when you rent from one of the large suppliers, be it like United or Sunbelt, when you rent typically on an hourly rate, once you get over a certain number of hours, they convert it to a day for you because it's a more advantageous rate. When you get over a certain amount of days, they roll it to a week because it's more advantageous. After like a couple of weeks, it usually rolls to a month because it gets you a better rate. So I've seen contractors attempt to just charge hourly for like days on end. And this is like hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then sometimes you go back and you look at what was negotiated with your procurement team, and you're like, oh no, you agreed to hourly only. That's something you need to be concerned with. That happens. You want to make sure, and anytime I look at a contract and I'm helping a client negotiate something, I make sure that those terms and conditions are in there, similar to what you would see within a national agreement where they roll up what would be reasonable. And you want to also make sure that they are, there's different tools out there available, like ones like RS Means. There's certain tools that are available to you to look at what construction costs should be in a certain region, or what you should be paying for a piece of rental equipment. I've seen many contractors try to overcharge well over maybe double what a national supply chain would charge you for a particular piece of equipment. So you really want to be super cognizant and do reasonableness testing to make sure that what they're charging you is reasonable to the market, and that they're charging you a rate that's also reasonable. And if you don't have anything agreed to, so this is when you have an absence of a contract actually benefits you. So if you don't have that agreed to in a contract, like a rate sheet, and they're trying to charge you hourly for all the equipment, you can go back and say, that's just out of market and I'm not going to pay it. I don't have a contract. You don't have a contract. We're both on the same playing field. We're going to negotiate this. I've done that many times. I've done a lot of dispute resolution trying to negotiate amounts because you're in no man's land. Neither one of you have a strong contract.
And what about mobilization and demobilization? Another thing we get a lot too in projects is like traffic control. That's another, things of that sort of nature. But I was kind of wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
So, it needs to make sense. So if you've got traffic control first and foremost, like large cities, that may be necessary. If I'm going to bring a crane on site, I'm probably going to have to, cordon off a city block. I've seen projects like that. I saw one where it's a very large asset that had to be moved from a port to a site, and it required moving it night by night. And you actually had to, lift, street lamps up in order to let it pass every night. So I had to move like one town per night. But that's not your traditional mob demob. That's a different cost. Mob demob is getting your people to the job site. So if I hire a contractor in Michigan and they're doing a project for me in South Carolina for 2 weeks, I'm going to pay for them to mobilize from Michigan to South Carolina. Now, if they try to give me a fixed price for that, and they say $50,000 to mobilize, I'm going to say, especially if I'm doing a T&M contract, I'm going to say, okay, walk me through the math. What's part of that? What are you charging me for? All right, well, I've got 10 pieces of equipment, trucks that we're bringing on site. Here's the mileage. That makes sense. If I'm paying for hourly rates for employees to drive or fly, does that make sense? All hoteling in between, if they're driving in between those two locations, you need to understand what the overall breakdown of that MOB and DMOB cost is. It needs to make sense. Anytime, and I don't care if it's MOB, DMOB, or anything, when I get a fixed amount from somebody, or even a not fixed amount, I always ask for that backup and I ask for the math. And if it's a fixed amount that's like $100,000, I know that may have been pulled out of their butt. It's not something that's necessarily a calculated amount.
So, Mike, is that something that you would hammer home when you're crafting the RFP and you're saying, "Hey, we're not going to accept a fixed, flat fee number for mobilization. You got to itemize it," or is that? I mean,
Yeah,
because
absolutely. So,
okay,
so when you do an RFP, that's on you. You can compel the contractor to do anything you want, really, in that RFP. If you want pure transparency, time and material, that's when you do that. And that's why I go back to this. I think a lot of times people probably just take the contract as it sits from the contractor. That's not what you want to do. You don't want to just accept their contract.
yeah, I think in everything I've seen, Mike, I just see a lump sum for mobilization, and like, oh, I'm like, okay, this guy's charging 12 grand, or for traffic control, for example, this guy's charging 12 grand, but this guy's charging five, or this guy's charging 25. It's all over the board. I'm like, how are they even getting these numbers? I'll be honest, I'd never even thought about asking for that granular level of disclosure in the RFP.
And you can do it in a very nice manner. I do it. I get on a phone call. I say, "Hey, walk me through your MOB and DMOB costs." And you do this before. And a lot of times, I have had people they're nervous with a contractor that comes in with like a really low amount. So let's say it's like 50,000 below everybody else on like maybe a $200,000 project. They're like, "Man, should I think I know this guy's good." Or I usually say, go back to the contractor if you want them to take a second stab at it. You think maybe they didn't sharpen their pencil enough, and say, "Are you sure about your number?" And just say that. And if they say, "Well, what do you mean? Are you sure about your number? Because we've done fair work with us in the past. I want to make sure your number's fair before we move forward here." If they say, "Well, was it too high or it's too low?" Walk away, because that's not good. They should be saying, "Hey, you know what? All right, let me take a look. I'll double check. I'll make sure the number's right." That's the answer you want to hear. You shouldn't have somebody fishing for you and saying, "Well, what do you mean by that?" Same thing with MOB and DMOB. You should be able to have a very cool, collected conversation and say, "Hey, can you walk me through? We're doing the RFP is closed. We're going through. We're doing a bid evaluation. I see that you've got $15,000 in here for MOB. I understand that you're only like one town away. I just want to kind of understand what's included in those costs. How did you arrive at that number?" And you're owed that. That should be something that you can actually have transparency to, and you should have some knowledge of how they're arriving at that number. It's a very reasonable thing in nature to ask is, how did you arrive at that number? I always like to do that. And if people start giving you the runaround, then you know that it's just a number that they just pulled out and that's what they want. And it's just a lot of profit built in there. Anytime I challenge on an invoice and I get the runaround, it's not good. That means that they're dog ate it, so to speak. They don't have all the backup support. You should get a quick turnaround. If you challenge an invoice on a contractor and they give you the runaround, it's not good. It should be a quick turnaround. Within 1 or 2 days, you should have all that backup support. That's what good looks like. That's somebody who's a partner, somebody that wants to be transparent, honest in how they bill you.
Yeah, I'm sure we have a lot of war stories here, Mike. And I just want to reiterate once again as we wrap up here that I think the value that you provide in a lot of ways is being that bad cop for those who maybe don't necessarily feel comfortable being that bad cop, or they don't feel like they're equipped with the knowledge or subject matter expertise to really push back. or they might feel like, hey, there's something doesn't seem right about this, but I don't know how to articulate it or really make my case. And I can see how you can be an intermediary in that respect. So I think there's a lot of value that you can provide to these organizations when it comes to trying to ensure that these projects are being built to spec and being built out properly. I just think there's a lot of room for improvement in the local government sphere when it comes to these vendor interactions. And I think that you can offer a lot of value to folks. So I'm really, really happy to have you on. I'm going to let you sort of wrap up and plug your website and whatever else you want to say, and then we'll call it a wrap.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed talking to the audience here, and I do agree. And I think there's a lot of value that I could help create municipalities across the U.S. And I know there's a lot of opportunities here, and I'd love to have any of you reach out to me. I've been networking in with probably quite a few of you, and yeah, you kind of have an understanding of what I do. And beat me to the punch. You link in with me. I love giving out free advice, as I just did here. Hit me up. I'm not a high pressure salesperson. If you'd like to learn more about what I can do, I operate like Miracle on 34th Street. Macy's doesn't have what you need. I'm more than happy to send you to Gimbals. So I'm not going to push you if I don't actually have the right solution for you, and I can try to help advise as well. So hit me up. I'd love to chat with any of you out there that are having some issues with your projects. And I know Joe said he's going to put my website on here. I can spell it out. It's long. I'm actually working on getting an abbreviated website direct link just to make it a little bit easier on folks. But it's Grabianowski&Associates.com, all one word, like my name. If you find me on LinkedIn, my website's there as well.
Absolutely. And I would appreciate it if, like I said, I'm not being compensated in any way. We don't have any financial arrangement, but I would love for you guys to let Mike know if you found him on the podcast, if you found him through the City Manager Unfiltered podcast. Please let him know. Love to hear what kind of traction we're getting with this episode. Thanks again, Mike. I'm Joe Turner. This is the City Manager Unfiltered podcast, a podcast for city managers and public sector executives. If you enjoyed the content, please hit that follow, subscribe button on your platform of choice. And if you've not left a review on Apple or a rating on Spotify, please do so when you have a moment. I would greatly appreciate it. Catch you next week.